Hello and welcome to QT Anatomy Live. I'm your presenter, Dr. Laura Gregory. The axial skeleton consists of the skull, the vertebral column and the rib cage. These bones have essential functions in protecting vital organs. The skull completely surrounds the brain. The spinal cord is completely protected by the vertebral column, and the rib cage protects the heart and lungs within the thoracic cavity. When we are born, we have more bones than is found in the adult. This is because some of the bones will fuse together as we grow. Interestingly, an example is the sacral vertebrae. When we are born, we have 5 individual sacral vertebrae. But as we grow, these 5 sacral elements fuse together to form a single element called the sacrum. The sacrum comes from the word sacred, and this name arose due to many observations of the sacrum being the last bone intact after cremation. It was therefore believed that the sacrum housed the soul, hence the term sacrum, referring to its sacred nature. The vertebral column has an important role in protecting the spinal cord. Any trauma or damage to the vertebral column can cause impingement of spinal nerves or compression on the spinal cord itself. This may lead to paralysis of muscles or sensory deficits. Embryologically, the vertebral column and the nervous tissue or nervous system develops at the same time. This means any disturbance in the development of the nervous system can cause significant deficits in the development of the axial skeleton. For example, nervous system deficits may result in acrania, that is, the lack of development of the skull, or the more common congenital disease, spina bifida, which is where elements of the vertebral column do not fuse together and allow the spinal cord to be exposed and vulnerable. In this online learning package focusing on the axial skeleton, we will become confident in identifying and describing the axial bones and their major features. Now let's look at the learning objectives for this online module. Firstly, we will describe and identify the major bony markings of the bones of the skull, hyoid bone, rib cage and vertebral column. We'll then look at the major joints of these regions. Let's start by looking at the bones of the skull. You can see that the bones can be grouped into 2 major regions. On the left, you can see the bones that enclose and protect the brain. These are called the cranial bones. There are 8 in total. On the right, you can see the facial bones. There are 14 facial bones, and these bones are important because they protect the openings of the digestive and respiratory systems. Let's now look at an animation of the skull. Here we can see an anterior view of the skull. As it spins around, we can identify the cranial bones and the facial bones. The bones of the skull have major joints called sutures. This is the primary joint type in the skull, and these joints are known as fibrous joints. Inferiorly, we can see a number of passageways called foramina. These are passageways for blood vessels and nerves. Let's now identify some of the major bones of the skull. Starting posteriorly, we have the occipital bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, frontal bone, nasal bones, zygomatic bones, maxillary bones, and mandible. Some bones are hard to see from the outside, so by extracting out those external bones, we can firstly see this bone called the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone looks like a butterfly. This anterior view, we can see the body and the wings of the sphenoid. Here we can see the sphenoid positioned in the skull, As we turn to a superior view, we can see an important depression called the sella turcica, meaning Turkish saddle. It is in this location we find the pituitary gland, which is the major endocrine gland of the body. Anteriorly, we find a small bone anterior to the sphenoid called the ethmoid bone. This bone contributes to a number of features of the nasal cavity, including the nasal septum here. Let's now review those bones again in these different illustrations of the skull. Firstly, from an anterior view, we can identify the frontal bone, the paired nasal bones, the paired maxillary bones, and in green, the zygomatic bones. The lower jaw is the mandible. Here we can see the answers coming up for each of those major bones, so you can use this as a study slide. Now let's look at the lateral view of the skull. Firstly, we can see this blue bone here, which makes up the majority of the lateral view. This is our parietal bone. It's a paired bone, and therefore we can find a right and left parietal bone. Anteriorly, we find the single frontal bone. This yellow bone here is the temporal bone. We can see it is located in this lateral view, and we can see it has this hole here which is associated with the structures of the ear. The zygomatic in yellow is also predominant, and we can see the lower jaw again, the mandible, and upper jaw, the maxilla. Note again the labelling to be used for review. Finally, we can see an inferior view of the skull. Let's identify again some of the major bones we can see from this view. The majority of the inferior view is taken up by the occipital bone in purple. The occipital bone has a large space inside, which is called the foramen magnum, meaning big hole. We can also see the upper jaw, which is the maxilla, and also the palatine bone forming this posterior portion of the hard palate. The sphenoid bone in blue here can be seen from this inferior position on the skull. Note again the labelling. You should refer to your learning and teaching manual to make sure of the detail that's required for your examination. This slide is here for review purposes only, and a lot of the detail on these slides is not necessary for your final examination. Paranasal sinuses are important air-filled spaces within your skull. They have an important function in lightening the skull and also humidifying the air. They also contribute to the resonance of our voice. The paranasal sinuses are located around the nasal cavity, hence the term para for parallel to the nasal cavity. Each of them connects by an opening into the nasal cavity. When we have an infection, the mucus inside the paranasal sinuses will increase in production and the sinuses will become filled with this mucus, causing them to become blocked. Hence, when we say we have blocked sinuses, we're referring to this buildup of mucus within the paranasal sinuses. Let's look at the individual paranasal sinuses. Here we can see the sphenoid sinus, the ethmoid sinuses, which consists of a number of small air cells, the frontal sinus, which can be highly variable in size and position, and the maxillary sinuses, which are the largest of the paranasal sinuses. The sutures, as mentioned earlier, are the major joint type of the skull. They are the only location where we find sutures. Sutures can be found between the major cranial bones, as we can see from these illustrations. Let's go through some examples of these fibrous joints. Firstly, the sagittal suture. The sagittal suture connects the right and left parietal bones. The coronal suture will separate the frontal bone from the parietal bones. You can see that those two sutures are named according to the plane that they are located in. Finally, from this posterior view, we can see the lambdoidal suture. This suture separates the occipital bone from the parietal bones. Let's now look at a number of bones individually. We will look at a number of important features in each of these bones. Firstly, the temporal bone. The temporal bone is a paired bone that is located in the lateral view. Note this important suture called the squamosal suture, which separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone. As mentioned earlier, the temporal bone contains this opening to the ear. This opening is called the external acoustic meatus and is a passageway into the middle ear and inner ear. The mastoid process is a large muscle attachment site that's found posterior to the external auditory meatus. You should be able to palpate this structure on your own skull just posterior to your ear. You will find that the male skull has a larger mastoid process. In this inferior view, we can see in green the occipital bone. Note that the occipital bone has this very large opening called the foramen magnum, and it is the space through which the spinal cord travels into the cranial cavity. Also note this important opening called the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen is located between the boundary of the occipital bone and the temporal bone. The jugular foramen is so named because it contains the internal jugular vein, which carries the blood from the cranial cavity into the neck. Here we can see the butterfly sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone, located deep inside the skull, consists of the sella turcica, which houses the pituitary gland, and also the lesser and greater wings. The ethmoid bone, as mentioned earlier, contributes to the nasal cavity structures. It includes this midline structure called the perpendicular plate, which contributes to the nasal septum, as well as a number of curled structures called the superior and middle nasal conchae. There are numerous facial bones within the skull. These include the vomer, mandible, and the paired maxilla, palatine, nasal, inferior nasal concha, lacrimal, and zygomatic bones. We will only be looking at a number of these bones which are larger and have important features that we need to identify. Let's start with the maxillae. The maxillae or maxillary bones are the upper jaws. They are the locations where we find a number of teeth, and therefore they have these processes called alveolar processes, which are these roundish structures that are elevated in which the teeth are located. Also note the contribution the maxilla has to the formation of the hard palate. You can see that the maxilla contributes to the anterior 2/3 of the hard palate structure. Moving on now to the mandible. In this lateral view of the mandible, we can see that it also contributes to the jaw structure, with these multiple teeth located within these sockets with these round elevations called alveolar processes around each tooth. The mandible consists of two major parts, which are the body, which is this large segment anteriorly, and these arms or branches called the rami or ramus singular. Note that the mandible contributes to the temporomandibular joint, which is a synovial joint between the temporal bone and the mandible. Note that it is at the temporomandibular joint that we have the movements of mastication and also movements when we are talking. The palatine bone contributes to the hard palate formation. Here in light blue we can see the palatine bone contributing to that posterior 1/3 of the hard palate. The nasal septum is formed from two major bones. This is the superiorly positioned ethmoid bone and the more postero-inferiorly positioned vomer, which is a single bone. The septal cartilage is also located in this position and contributes to the nasal septum. It is a hyaline cartilaginous plate located anteriorly. When we look internally within the cranial fossa, we can see three steps or three spaces. These are the anterior, middle, and posterior fossae, which are regions located inside the cranial cavity in which the levels of the brain are located. You can see that the anterior fossa houses the frontal lobe, the middle fossa the temporal lobe, and the posterior fossa houses the cerebellum. We've now completed our review of the skull, and now we move down to a number of other bones making up the axial skeleton. Here we can see the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a very interesting bone because it's located in the neck and it does not have any articulations with any other bones. It consists of a large anterior segment called the body, as well as this long branch area called the greater cornu, referring to a horn-like appearance. The hyoid bone has important functions in stabilizing the larynx and contributing to swallowing and speech. The thoracic cage refers to the sternum, costal cartilages, ribs, and thoracic vertebrae. The rib cage, on the other hand, consists of all of those elements except for the thoracic vertebrae. Therefore, the rib cage includes the sternum, costal cartilages, and ribs only. The thoracic cage is very important because it protects the heart and lungs in the thoracic cavity, as well as the major structures that are passing through the thoracic cavity to get to the abdominal cavity. Let's now look at each of the bones of the rib cage, starting with the sternum. The sternum actually consists of three major parts. Starting superiorly is the manubrium of the sternum, or manubrium sterni. The largest part in the middle is the body, and most inferiorly is this small xiphoid process, or xiphisternum. The sternum is extremely important as it articulates with both the clavicle and therefore the appendicular skeleton, as well as the costal cartilages, which stabilize the ribs and therefore the rib cage. Let's now look at the ribs. The ribs can be grouped into two major types. We have the true ribs, which consists of rib pairs 1 to 7, and we have the false ribs, which consists of rib pairs 8 to 12. These groupings are based on the costal cartilages. You can see in the true ribs that each rib has its own costal cartilage, rib 1, rib 2, and so forth. But when we look at ribs 8 to 12, you can see that the costal cartilage relationship changes. Firstly, let's look at ribs 8, 9, and 10. Here you can see in ribs 8, 9, and 10 that these ribs actually connect to a more superior costal cartilage and therefore do not have their own costal cartilage element that connects to the sternum. This is why they're called false ribs, because they do not actually contain an individual costal cartilage that connects directly to the sternum. Ribs 11 and 12 also have costal cartilage on their ends, but this costal cartilage is not connected indirectly or directly to the sternum. Therefore, these false ribs 11 and 12 are referred to as floating ribs. Let's look at the articulation between the rib and the thoracic vertebrae. Here we can see the head of the rib articulating with the bodies of the vertebrae. This is known as the costo-vertebral joint. This location here we can see a small swelling called the tubercle. The tubercle also articulates with the vertebrae at the transverse process. This joint is therefore called the costo-transverse joint. The largest part of the rib is called the shaft, and this anterior end is called the costal end, as it is the region that articulates with the costal cartilage and then the sternum. Let's now turn our attention to the vertebral column. This is the last element of the axial skeleton that we will cover. The vertebral column consists of a number of regions, and this is associated with changes in the specific morphology and features of the vertebrae according to the different movements that occur within the different regions of the back. Firstly, in the neck we find the cervical vertebrae. This consists of 7 individual cervical vertebrae. Then we have the thoracic vertebrae, consisting of 12 thoracic vertebrae. The lumbar region, which consists of 5 lumbar vertebrae. And finally, in the adult, the single sacrum and coccyx. Note that in the child and juvenile, you will find that the sacrum consists of 5 individual sacral vertebrae, and the coccyx typically 4 individual coccygeal vertebrae. In the adult, however, these fuse together to form a single sacral element and a single coccyx. Note that in the vertebral column we have a number of curvatures which help to distribute the weight of the body and therefore reduce the amount of muscle support that's required to keep our body in this erect position. Here we can see a superior view of a typical vertebra. Let's run through the main features that we can identify on each vertebra of the vertebral column. Firstly, we see this large region here, which is more anterior in position, called the body. The body can be multiple shapes depending on the region it is found. Then we have a large arch called the vertebral arch. The vertebral arch surrounds this space called the vertebral foramen, which contains the spinal cord. Extending out from the vertebral arch, we have a number of processes. These consist of the transverse processes, which are paired and located more laterally, and the posteriorly located spinous process, which is a single element pointing posteriorly and can be palpated, as well as the superior and inferior articular processes, which are important for the articulation between adjacent vertebrae. The joints of the vertebral column consists of the anterior intervertebral joints, which is a fibrocartilaginous joint called a symphysis. These fibrocartilaginous joints are extremely important to absorb the shock and the load that's placed within the back region. Another important joint of the vertebral column is the median atlantoaxial joint. This is a type of pivot synovial joint. We can see it moving here in this animation, where you can see the first cervical vertebra, called the atlas, pivoting or rotating around the second cervical vertebra, called the axis. This movement is when the head is basically saying no and shaking from side to side. Here we can see an illustration of the posterior view of the sacrum and coccyx. Let's identify a few features that are important in the sacrum. On the lateral aspect, identify the auricular surface. Auricular refers to the shape of an ear, auricle referring to the ear itself. The auricular surface is important because it's an articular site for the hip bone or ossa coxa. This joint is called the sacroiliac joint. In the posterior view, you will see this palpable region here called the median sacral crest. This is where the spinous processes of the individual sacral vertebrae have fused together. As mentioned earlier, the coccyx typically consists of 4 individual coccygeal bones which are fused together. Some individuals may have less or more of these coccygeal bones that are fused.